On this week's exciting episode of the Perry Pod, we've got a case, a sleepwalker, and a niece. You know what that adds up to? Season 1, Episode 2 of Perry Mason, The Case of the Sleepwalker's Niece. Welcome to the second episode of the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy, and my purpose here is pretty simple. Provide an audio companion to the greatest legal drama in television history. The goal is to do a pod for every episode of the television series, and if time permits, to cover some of those made-for-TV movies, too. I'll be working through the series in the order in which the episodes were aired. Each week, I'll give a brief refresher on the plot, and I'll compare changes to the novel, if the episode was based on one, or compare it to a similar plot from an earlier episode. Next, I'll list some key pieces of trivia and then tackle the episode's main theme. We'll finish with a big takeaway, a Perry proverb, if you will. But first, a new addition to the Perry Pod's office, to the law library. Fans of Perry will be familiar with the law library adjacent to Perry's office. It's where he puts clients who are on the run from the police, should antagonists like Lieutenant Tragg come by, and it is, one presumes, a place of research and meditation for our intrepid legal hero. On this show, it will be a place where we can review previous episodes of the podcast and maybe fill in some details that we missed the first time around. Many thanks to two key resources I've found in putting together this podcast. First, Jim Davidson's book, The Perry Mason Book, A Comprehensive Guide, available as a Kindle ebook from Amazon, is indispensable. And the Perry Mason TV series wiki site is another invaluable resource for both the novels and TV show. Now to this week's law library detail. I wanted to briefly return to the case of the restless redhead. Something I omitted in my description of the plot of that show and its difference from the novel was the way both begin. In the novel, Evelyn Bagby is on trial for stealing some jewels, and her counsel is a young attorney named Frank Neely. We see Perry Mason come into court because he wants to meet with the judge who's presiding over the case. But he takes an interest in the young defense attorney, gives him some advice, and helps him win the case. We get to see Perry as a mentor. Now, this is all well and good. The reason I'm returning to it is because it gives us a rare glimpse into Mason's technique. Mason actually gives Neely advice about how to ask questions, and his big piece of advice is ask a lot of them. Fire them at the witness. Do not allow the witness to get comfortable. I bring this up because as I read the novel for this week's episode, The Case of the Sleepwalker's Niece, I realized that the main difference for me between the experience of reading the novels and watching the television series are the barrage of questions you get in the novels that just aren't there in the TV show. Both Berger and Mason are far more direct in TV, and of course that's because of time. But if you go back and start reading the novels, I think you'll see that Gardner's character practices what he preaches. When he says fire a lot of questions, he fires a lot of questions. All right, now let's get to the plot of this week's episode, The Case of the Sleepwalker's Niece. As the title of the episode might indicate, we open on a man walking in his sleep, one Peter Cole. The problem is that poor Cole tends to pick up murder weapons when he's asleep, and in this case, it's a butcher knife that he carries into the bedroom of his wife Doris while holding said weapon.
Uncle Pete! Uncle Pete!
What happened?
He's
What's
going
wrong?
to kill me! He's going to kill me!
Oh, Doris, be quiet! Uncle Pete, wake up.
That's a really good way to end a marriage. The next thing we know, it's a year later and Doris is separated from Peter, and is being wooed financially and sexually by Cole's business partner, Frank Maddox.
Suppose I showed you how you could make $100,000 by sitting tight.
Are you serious?
You know me, Doris. I don't joke when it comes to money. It's much too sacred.
Frank Maddox insists that if Doris will wait to get a divorce, they can both make a lot of cash. This is because Peter wants to get married to someone new, and Frank Maddox, with the help of his attorney, Ralph Duncan, are going to try to use this as leverage to get some serious coin from the wealthy Cole. The Sleepwalker's niece, Edna Hammer, is obviously upset about this, so she asks her boyfriend, Steve, what he would do.
Steve, if you were in trouble and needed a lawyer, who would you call?
I'm a poor boy, honey.
I mean if money were no object.
If money was no object, then he would call on Perry. Perry convenes the involved parties at Peter's house and figures out a way he thinks to get Peter married and out from under Frank Maddox's thumb.
And Jackson will be in court first thing in the morning. Now, once the judge has signed the decree, I want you and Lucille to get married immediately.
But they can't get married immediately. There's a 3-day wait.
Not in Nevada.
The only problem? Maddox switches rooms with Cole's stepbrother, and in the morning, the unfortunate stepbrother winds up dead, stabbed through his bedsheets with a butcher knife. How will Perry get the sleepwalking Peter Cole off when Cole claims he doesn't even know if he committed the crime?
You think Cole will tell you the truth if you find him?
Have you ever asked a sleepwalker to tell you the truth? Did you kill Philip?
I honestly don't know.
The niece's boyfriend, Steve Harris, turns out to be a crucial witness for the prosecution and defense. He ties Frank Maddox to Doris Cole to show they were conniving to get Peter Cole's money, point for the defense. But he also testifies that the butcher knife was gone from its typical spot the night of the murder, making it seem like Peter Cole premeditated the crime.
I went to Santa Barbara that night. The knife was gone before I left.
Oh. What time was that?
Around 10?
Well, then you left before Peter Cole went to bed.
Well, what's that got to do?
Well, if the knife was gone before Mr. Cole went to bed.
Point for the prosecution. Of course, with a witness this important, you know Perry is going to focus on him, and in a dramatic court sequence, we see Perry expose the boyfriend Steve as, wait for it,
Your fiancée, Miss Hammer, would inherit all of the Cole enterprises.
Well, she would have anyway.
But you couldn't wait. You were tired of being poor. You were tired of playing the nice, clean-cut boy.
Mr. Mason, I tell you, I was in Santa Barbara. I was standing right there when I heard that phone conversation.
How is that possible, Steve? When that isn't a photograph of Mrs. Cole's home at all.
the killer. Peter ends the episode ready to get married. Edna, the titular niece, must figure out what to do since she's been emotionally and romantically invested in a murderer. All right, let's take a quick look at the novel for a comparison. 3 things to note. Number 1, despite its title, the TV episode isn't really about the sleepwalker's niece. It's about the sleepwalker and the sleepwalker's niece's boyfriend. On the other hand, the novel really does earn its title by focusing much more on Edna. It turns out, for instance, that she's a sleepwalker too, and she's crucial in a way to Gardner's story that the TV writers Gene Wang and Lawrence Marks in this case decided to forego. But it's not as though Gardner was complaining. He famously wrote the show's producer, Gail Patrick Jackson, to say this was the best hour of television he had ever seen right after he watched the episode. Number 2, again, in the novel, there's a bunch of extraneous Perry shenanigans that don't get into the TV show. Really interesting, he sets up Doris, Peter's ex-wife, with a gold digger to force her hand at letting Peter get a divorce. He introduces a duplicate of the murder weapon, the knife, into the proceedings to try and test a witness's recollection. Perry really does skirt the line of legality, or at least legal ethics. And then finally, in the novel, the climax plays out much differently than in the TV show. Perry doesn't get a real "he did it" moment in court. Steve, or in this case, in the novel, his name is Jerry, disappears from court after some damning testimony, and so the book's final chapter is Perry spelling out the crime and its motives. No fake photograph. In the novel, Harris and Edna are actually secretly married. The motive is still the cash that Harris wants from Edna's family, but it's got a different spin on it. In any case, if you're looking for the same kind of gotcha thrills of the TV show when you read the book, you're out of luck. Now let's talk trivia. Remember, in our trivia subject each week, I'll give you 3 takeaways: a Paul, a Della, and a Perry. A Paul is a subject worth investigating more. A Della is something about a particular character in the story. And a Perry is where we learn something crucial about our central character. Our Paul this week has to do with sleepwalking as a defense for murder. Gardner's novel references a book titled Sleepwalking and Moonwalking, a medico-literary study by Dr. J. Sager of Vienna. It was an actual book, published in German in 1914 and translated into English in 1920. Here's my recommendation. Do a little Google search on homicidal sleepwalking, and you'll see cases from just the past 30 years where sleepwalking has been used as a defense in a murder trial. Our Della this week involves Jackson, Perry Mason's law clerk.
What are you working on, Jackson?
I'm going over the transcripts of the Campfield libel suit.
Well, that can wait. I'd like you to run up to Santa Barbara and find out the exact status of Doris Cole versus Peter Cole, divorce case. We're representing the husband.
Now, Jackson was a regular in the novels, but he only appears in 2 Perry episodes, and this is one of them. And finally, our Perry this week. Perry fans have long included Perry and Della shippers. That is, people who have waited for the moment for the relationship between the boss and his secretary to develop personally as well as professionally. And this episode gives us perhaps the most intimate moment between the two, physically intimate moment at least, in the entire series. Della gives Perry a back rub.
How was the trip to Las Vegas?
Rough, any way you look at it. Boy, that feels good.
It says a lot, though, that Perry doesn't even take off his coat for the back rub. Ultimately, the two were platonic, and until the two characters kissed in an early 90s TV movie, this was about as intimate as the two ever got. Now it's time to explore the episode's main theme, self-awareness. This is front and center in Peter Cole's case because he's doing things in his sleep that he doesn't realize. And one of the main questions is, could he commit murder in his sleep if when he's conscious, he would never imagine doing that? Again and again, we'll hear Perry's clients testify to the fact that they don't think themselves capable of committing murder. And yet, here they are, on trial for a capital crime. As always, Perry is the character who knows himself best. Now it's time for a Perry proverb. This week's Perry proverb comes from the end of the episode where Della and Perry discuss Peter Cole's impending marriage.
They deserve a wonderful honeymoon.
I hope he doesn't walk in his sleep.
After waiting 15 years?
Again and again in this first season, we find that bad marriages are a source of violence. Perry knows that even good people like Edna can be duped by conmen like Steve. His hope is not just that Peter stops walking in his sleep literally, but that this marriage will give him peace. Della thinks it will. That's why we love her. She's an eternal optimist. Thanks so much for joining me on this second episode of the Perry Pod. Until next time, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Park Avenue beat.